Hello, welcome back to early U.S. history. This week I'm going to be discussing the further settlement of English colonies in North America, the growing demand for labor in the colonies, and how some factors led to the transition from indentured servitude to slavery. And finally, later on this week, I'll be discussing some of the conflicts that took place in early colonial era and how those conflicts shaped the relationships among our three main groups of people: the European settlers, the Native Americans, and African slaves. When we talk about settling these British colonies in North America, the three G's serve as kind of a primary rationale for colonization in general, but very often the Crown would grant individual charters for specific colonies based on factors unrelated to the three G's. For example, sometimes the Crown would grant a charter for a colony in order to serve as a dumping ground for undesirable elements in British society. The Puritans, a religious minority seen as troublemakers within English society, moved to Massachusetts. So again, as an example of how sometimes these undesirable elements of society can use a colony to make an escape or an exodus from England. Sometimes criminals or debtors will be the target of this colony, as an example of Georgia we'll talk about later on today. The two types of colonies, or another reason that the Crown might grant a charter for a specific colony, is as a favor or to pay off a debt. The king's power really depended on the loyalty of the nobles in England, and of course this is the case in any other country as well. But sometimes to secure the loyalty of these nobles, the king would grant a charter of land in the New World as kind of a gift to encourage or foster these nobles to be loyal to him. So again, these the reasons the Crown used to grant individual colonies was sometimes a little bit different than the overall rationale of the three G's. When we talk about some of these colonies, we've got two basic colonies: proprietary colonies and royal colonies. Now, we've already discussed some of the royal colonies. Virginia and Massachusetts, we've already discussed those at length, so we're not going to go too deep into those. These are all royal colonies wherein the Crown granted a charter specifically to settle a colony. So there was a specific goal here to establish a colony. We talked about before, Rhode Island was split off of Massachusetts. Connecticut and New Hampshire will be formed in a similar manner, both of these colonies splitting off from Massachusetts. And again, this was due in large part to the rapid growth of the Massachusetts colony. Remember, we talked about a lot of the immigrants pouring into Massachusetts, these Puritan families and others pouring into the area. The colony is growing very rapidly, so there was a need to have this population spread out over larger areas, so hence the formation of Connecticut and New Hampshire. Delaware, which will split off in a similar manner from Pennsylvania, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, is our last royal colony. So all these are royal colonies. They were all established with a charter specifically intended to form a colony. That was their main reason for establishing. And when we look at the big differences between royal colonies and proprietary colonies, on the ground, in reality, there's very little to discern the difference. The main difference is in the way they were officially established. Taking a look now at our proprietary colonies, excuse me. A proprietary colony basically is where the Crown has granted a large tract of land to an individual or to a group of individuals, and it's their land. The king is like, here, thanks for your loyalty. Here's a big chunk of land in the New World. It's yours. Do what you want to with it. Basically, these proprietors, either the individual or the group of individuals, they are the owners of this large tract of land. It's theirs to do with as they please. Now, they're not necessarily required to establish a colony here, whereas in the royal colonies, the charter was specifically for the establishment of a colony. Here, the land belongs to the proprietor. He can do whatever he wants to with it. Now, the problem is, whether he builds a colony or not, he still has to pay taxes on this land. The best way to generate the revenue that he's going to need to pay for these taxes is to sell or lease pieces of this land to other individuals. And the easiest way to do that is to establish a colony, attract settlers. Settlers come in, you grant them small pieces of land on which they pay taxes and which you can use to pay your tax liability to the crown. So again, these colonies were established by individuals for various individual reasons, not necessarily at the direction of the crown. So a proprietor basically is simply the owner of something. If you're the proprietor of a bookstore, then you are the owner of that bookstore. So proprietary colonies, colonies owned or established by an individual or group of individuals. Maryland is our first one on our list here, 1634. Charles I is going to grant a large tract of land to a guy named George Calvert. His title was Lord Baltimore. The current city of Baltimore was named after this George Calvert. At any rate, Calvert is a Catholic still living in England, and this is problematic because Catholics are one of these religious minorities in England that are struggling to find a place for themselves. Remember, I mentioned last week that not everyone in England embraced Protestantism. While the Anglican Church, English Protestants, that's the official church of England, there are still some in England who remain Catholic, and they're going to be one of these persecuted minorities. Calvert is one of these English Catholics, and it's his intent to use Maryland, his grant of land, as a refuge, a safe haven for these persecuted Catholics that are living in England. And this worked for a while. You know, there some English Catholics moved to Maryland, and that is how the colony is established. What ends up happening, though, is that most of the people moving into Maryland are not Catholic. They're Protestants. A lot of these people are moving into Maryland from Virginia. And of course, keep in mind that geographically speaking, Maryland is right across the Chesapeake Bay from Virginia. So this is an easy move for some of those settlers coming out of Virginia as that colony grows. So the bottom line here is that Lord Baltimore's haven for English Catholics has turned into just another English Protestant settlement. And it starts to look a lot like Jamestown and Virginia in terms of economic activities, you know, tobacco plantations and dispersed settlements and so on and so forth. So the local government, again, there's a council established in Maryland, very similar to the Virginia House of Burgesses. So Maryland basically becomes a clone of Virginia. Calvert's intention to turn this into a haven for Catholics didn't really work out the way he had planned. So what he ends up doing is to further ensure that his Catholic minority is protected in this new colony of Maryland, he passes the Religious Toleration Act in 1649. Now this is important because this is one of the first specific statements of religious freedom in the New World. Basically, Calvert says in this Religious Toleration Act that all adult males in Maryland are granted voting rights and office holding rights as long as they were Christian. So this is not true religious freedom here. This is religious freedom within Christianity. So Calvert says here in Maryland you are free to be Catholic or Protestant, whichever you choose, but it's understood that you're going to be Christian at least. So again, this is our first specific statement of religious rights in the colonies, and it's still kind of limited, though. It's not true religious freedom, but it's a step in that direction. I spoke last week in general how sometimes, although this is a U.S. history class, very often we see issues and events in Europe affecting or impacting what goes on here in the colonies. And this English Civil War is one of our first big examples of that. In 1642, a civil war breaks out in England. Basically, this is a struggle between Parliament and the King for who's going to have the most authority or the most power, how power will be shared, if at all. And this was not a new debate. Parliament had been arguing with the king or the crown over power and authority since its development, or since its formation back in 1215 with the Magna Carta. Again, Parliament had no official authority to make laws. Now today, of course, Parliament is like our Congress. They are a legislative body. They make the laws that govern English society. At this time, however, Parliament is still more or less an advisory body to the king. The king is the one who makes the laws. This idea of absolute divine right of kings that still is predominant in Europe at this time. The king is the sole authority of power, the sole source of power. He derives his power from being ordained by God, and he answers only to God. So many kings are reluctant to share any of this authority with their representative assemblies. Parliament is not a true representative assembly. None of these people were elected. They were just they started out as a group of nobles that joined together and formed a body to seek recognition from the crown. So at any rate, Parliament is trying to gain more authority, more power. The king does not want to give them this power. So this is Charles I. Charles I was a firm believer in the divine right of kings. He does not want to share power with Parliament at all. Charles is like, God has ordained me king, and I answer to no one but God. So Charles here again is putting his foot down. He's not going to share power with Parliament, but Parliament is not going to let this go. They're going to keep pushing for this shared power, and it's going to end up in a civil war where both Parliament and the king will raise armies, and these armies will fight for 6 years, struggling for control of English government. Now it's a real mess. Very little is accomplished here other than a lot of bloodshed and a lot of turmoil and anger and bitterness. Eventually, though, the parliamentary army will win and the king will be captured and executed. They're basically going to chop off his head, and that'll be the end of the monarchy in England, at least for a little while. So once the king is executed, Parliament abolishes the monarchy. There's no more monarchy in England. This is a commonwealth. This works out okay for a little while, but it unravels fairly quickly. Parliament is unable to maintain control, and eventually what happens is the leader of the parliamentary army, a guy named Oliver Cromwell, he seizes control and turns England into a military dictatorship. So this whole thing has come unraveled. Eventually Cromwell will die and Parliament will reconvene and they will restore the monarchy. And this is in 1660. So after about 20 years of civil war and political turmoil in England, they're finally ready to get things back to normal. Basically what they do is they just fix everything back the way it was before the war started. The bottom line here is that during this whole time period, while England is focused on these internal struggles, there are no new colonies being established in the New World. No new British colonies, that is. So those few colonies that have been established, that's it. For 20 years, more than 20 years, they're pretty much on their own. England is just focused on internal matters, and the colonies are just kind of left to do their own thing. No new colonies are being established. So that's why we see such a long spell between the establishment of Maryland and the establishment of the next colonies, which are the Carolinas. Once Parliament decides to restore the monarchy, it's going to be kind of a tedious process. They've got to find somebody to be king. They want to have a monarch. They've got to have somebody to be king. And the natural choice here is the son of the former king, Charles II. They executed Charles I, and then a few years later they go to his son, Charles II. Hey, I know we killed your dad, but we'd like you to be king if you don't mind. So this is kind of an awkward moment in British history, this whole restoration of the monarchy. But they get it all sorted out. They restore the Charles's family to the throne, and we've got a new king. Everything's back the way it was before. Now, in the process of restoring Charles II to the throne, a lot of favors were done. A lot of expense and trouble was gone to in order to facilitate this. So the bottom line here is that Charles II owes a lot of people a lot of favors and money. In order to pay off these debts, Charles II is going to start making land grants in the New World. So here's where we're going to get started creating colonies again. First up is the Carolina territory. Some of the noblemen, some businessmen that had given Charles a lot of money, helped him reposition himself as monarch. Charles is going to give this group, it's about 8 English noblemen that are all part of the same little group here. He's going to grant them all the land between Virginia and Spanish Florida. Basically, this is a huge piece of land. What's going to happen now is that these English noblemen are going to start to establish a colony here. They're going to sell off pieces of this land, or they're going to start leasing it off to the other settlers in an attempt to make money. Charles just gave them the land. Here, thanks for all you did for me. Here's land in payment for the debt that I owe you. So in the eyes of the crown, the matter is done. But these English gentlemen that are going to form this colony, it's their business now. They're going to start bringing in people to settle this new colony. What ends up happening is, again, the reality of this situation is that people have already started moving into this territory even before the land was granted as a colony. Especially in the northern part of this Carolina territory, people had already begun moving out of Virginia. By this time, by 1663, Virginia is a prospering colony. They're growing larger. People are moving in there all the time. Tobacco plantations are growing larger. New tobacco plantations are being formed. Immigrants are pouring in, and so forth. So a lot of these settlers in Virginia have already begun moving south into what is today this area of North Carolina. So what happens is that when we establish the Carolina colony, and it was just one colony to begin with. I've got 2 dates mentioned here on the slide. That's the first date is when the colony was established, and the second date was when it split into a North and South Carolina. But this northern part of the Carolina colony starts to look just like Virginia, which of course looks just like Maryland. So we see a pattern of settlement here taking place. These colonies in and around the Chesapeake Bay area all are very similar. Virginia, Maryland, and this northern part of Carolina, they all look the same types of people doing the same types of activities in the same manner, similar types of local government. Again, very, very similar, a lot of similarities among these 3 colonies. In the southern part of this Carolina colony, things are going to be a little bit different. And this is our first really big variation here. A lot of what we've seen so far are similar patterns. One colony looking just like the next, and so forth. With this Carolina colony, especially in the south, things are going to be assuming a much different pattern. A lot of the settlers that were moving into this southern half of the Carolina colony were British settlers coming out of a British colony in Barbados. Now, it's important to remember that although we're focused on the British colonies in North America, you need to know that there are many British colonies in other parts of the world too. There's a dozen or more British colonies in the Caribbean. England has already started exploring and colonizing in the Southeast Asia, in the East Indies, and so forth. So these British colonists out of Barbados, it's an island, so there's only so much real estate there. That colony has grown to capacity. No more colonists can fit in Barbados, so they're looking for someplace else to go. Just like Virginia is growing and spreading out, those Caribbean colonies are growing in a similar manner, but there's no place for them to spread, so they're going to have to go somewhere else. These settlers out of Barbados are going to come to this new Carolina colony in North America. Here's where the story gets a little bit different. When these settlers come out of Barbados, they're going to bring everything with them. Their lifestyle, their economic activities, basically the way they've been doing things for the past several years, they're going to bring all of that with them. One of the things they're going to bring with them are their slaves. In the Caribbean, the British colonies were very similar to the Spanish and Portuguese colonies in that same region, in that they had adopted an economic activity of large-scale plantation agriculture, sugar plantations, rice in particular. So when these settlers come out of Barbados into Carolina, they're going to bring this model of plantation agriculture with them, to include large-scale slave labor. So for the first time now, we see a significant number of slaves being brought into North America. Up to this point, prior to the 1660s, basically for the previous 50 years of British colonization in North America, there's been very few slaves. Very few. There were slaves at Jamestown, but they were in such small numbers they were almost unnoticeable. Now, for the first time, we have significant numbers of slaves being brought into the colonies. So after a few years, of course, after about 50 years or so, we've got enough people living in this Carolina colony to where we've got two distinct situations going. We've got smaller scale tobacco farms, and we've got large scale sugar, or not really sugar, but rice plantations. So the colony is kind of pulling in two different directions here. So that's when they split the colony in two, North Carolina and South Carolina. Hence the two dates you see on the slide there. So already we've got some, we finally now have all three pieces of all three of the main groups of people in our story. We've got British settlers, we've got Native Americans, and now we have large numbers of Africans as well being brought into the story. So all three groups of our major players in this story are present in North America at this point. Looking up the coast there to the New England area, we're going to see New York and New Jersey being formed at the same time in 1664. Now, this is another unique piece of our story. Up to this point, all of our settlers have been British citizens, coming either from England or from other colonies within the British Empire. In the case of New York and New Jersey, a lot of these people are people other than Englishmen. When the English gained control of this colony, it's already established. It was established by the Dutch many years prior. As England is settling Jamestown and Plymouth, the Dutch are settling in what is today New York, the Hudson River region, the island of Manhattan. So this colony is already settled. So England is not going to establish this colony. They are going to take possession of it. So here we see a different piece of the story, different type of arrangement here. So what ends up happening, long story short, England and the Netherlands are fighting a trade war back in Europe, over separate issues that are unrelated to what's going on here in North America. So this trade war goes on for a few years. England ends up winning this war, and as their prize, they get access to some of these Dutch colonies, namely the Dutch colony of New Netherlands. So England obtained this colony as a prize in a war. They didn't settle it themselves. It's a kind of a bloodless battle. When the English are given possession of this, the British Navy sails into the harbor at New Amsterdam. The Dutch colonists there, they surrender without a fight. They're like, fine, whatever, we don't want any trouble. We just want to go about our business and live our lives. They take down the Dutch flag, they put up the British flag, and that's pretty much the end of it. So this is now a British colony. What ends up happening, the Dutch stay there, and some British citizens start moving in. So we've got at this point, we've got a different cultural composition than we've had in any of the other colonies. All the other colonies at this point are all British. Here in New York, New Jersey, we've got a mix of Englishmen and Dutchmen. So we've got a little bit of cultural diversity going on at this point in the story. It was named New York after the king's brother, the Duke of York, who was given this land by the king. It's, again, another one of these land grants as a return for a favor. Charles II is like, hey brother, I appreciate you standing by me all these years. Here's a gift. You can have this colony that we just got from the Dutch. It's yours. you can be the leader of it. And so they just rename it New York after the Duke of York, who is the king's brother. New Jersey, they just split it in two. It's later the same year. As soon as they got possession of it, there was enough people living there, they could just justify splitting it in two. So that's how the colony of New Jersey was created. So again, we've got a little bit different story here with New York and New Jersey than we've seen thus far. England gaining access to a colony that was already established by somebody else. Pennsylvania is going to be another unique story. Again, emphasizing this idea of uniqueness because we start to see a lot of variation. The more colonies that are established, the more variation we see, and we start to see a lot of diversity in terms of people and ideas and economic activities across these 13 colonies. Pennsylvania is another one of these land grants given as payment for an old debt. A guy named William Penn is going to receive this grant of land from Charles II, who owed Penn's father a lot of money. Penn's father had served Charles II years ago, and Charles owed him a lot of money. Of course, Penn's father is dead at this point, so there's no one to pay the debt to. Charles offers the grant of land to William Penn, the son. So at any rate, as payment for an old debt, William Penn ends up with this large grant of land in the New World. Of course, we see where the name Pennsylvania comes from. He pretty much named this colony after himself. Penn, and this is where the uniqueness of this colony comes into play. Penn was a Quaker. Quakers, just FYI, are another offshoot of Protestant Christianity. After the Protestant Revolution, Protestant branch of Christianity began to fracture into several smaller sects. That's where we get the Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterians, Quakers, and so on and so forth. Just a little footnote here for you. Quakers are somewhat, or at least during this time period, Quakers are seen as somewhat radical among the Protestant community. They granted women equality within the church, which is something no other Protestant sect believed in. They didn't recognize any kind of racial or social hierarchies among people in society. So again, this is kind of a radical departure from the traditional Protestant beliefs. Again, this is just another branch of Protestant Christianity. But as such, they are going to be one of these small religious minorities being persecuted in England. So Penn wants to use this colony of Pennsylvania as a refuge for this Quaker minority from England. That works out. A lot of Quakers come to Pennsylvania and they settle there, and it seems to be working. But there's not that many of them. They're a relatively small group of people, so there's not quite enough of them to establish a full-blown colony. So Penn starts looking elsewhere for settlers. He basically produces an ad campaign. He prints a lot of pamphlets and brochures and starts circulating these around Europe in an attempt to attract new settlers to Pennsylvania. And it works, especially among Northern and Western Europeans, the kind of the center of Protestant Christians in Europe. The most people who end up taking advantage of this offer by Penn to settle in Pennsylvania are Germans. There was several thousand Germans ended up coming to Pennsylvania in a very short space of time to take advantage of these land grants that Penn was offering to new settlers. Somewhere in the neighborhood of about 7,000 Germans are going to show up in the first couple of years. So again, this is going to take off really fast. Thanks to his ad campaign, he's going to attract a lot of settlers. Some people are coming from various places in Europe, but the majority of them were Germans. What's going to end up happening here is that Pennsylvania, in a similar way to Maryland, will become kind of a place where religious tolerance is practiced. Again, within the confines of Christianity. So we've got some variation here as well, just like we see in New York, where we have English settlers now living next to Dutch settlers. In Pennsylvania, we've got Englishmen and Germans and people from other places in Europe as well. So we've got a little bit more variety in terms of cultural composition, especially in New York and Pennsylvania. But, in fact, this is kind of foreshadowing what we see today. New York is one of the most cosmopolitan cities on earth. You can find people in New York from every culture, from every country in the world. That cultural diversity begins here in the early colonial era, where New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania are all being settled by people from a variety of different countries. All right, our final piece of the puzzle here, Georgia, 1732. Now, you can see it's quite a bit of time here between Pennsylvania, New York, those other colonies that we just established, the Carolinas. They were all formed in right around about the same time frame. Quite a bit of years have passed before the colony of Georgia is settled. And again, it just takes time to fill up these colonies and get people to move into the New World. Georgia is going to be unique for some other different reasons. Totally different than we've talked about so far. When the colony of Georgia was established in 1732, it was established by a group of philanthropists, English philanthropists. They received the charter from the king, basically, again, as just a payment for debt. What they did here is they are intending to use this colony as kind of a buffer colony. South Carolina at this point is very prosperous. We've got our rice plantations growing and prospering, a lot of money being made in South Carolina. Florida is still controlled by the Spanish. Now, England and Spain are not what you call really good friends at this point. There's still some old animosities from the Spanish Armada back in the late 1500s. So while they're not at war, there is a fair amount of animosity between England and Spain. Georgia is going to serve as kind of a buffer between the British Carolinas and Spanish Florida. So they want to settle this territory, so there's something there to protect Carolina from any possible encroachment or invasion by Spanish Florida. But in order to fill up this colony with people, they need some people. There's not a lot of people willing to move to this frontier. You're looking to invest in a plantation. You don't want to move into Georgia because, okay, if I spend a fortune building a plantation in Georgia and the Spanish invade, I'm going to lose everything. I don't want to be the buffer. I don't want to be the buffer state. I want to be in a more secure state. So they're trying to get people to move into Georgia. It's not really working out. So what they decide to do at the same time period we're talking about here, it just so happened that a lot of the debtors' prisons in England were filling up rapidly. This time in history, if you don't pay your debts, if you owe money, you've borrowed money that you can't pay back, or if you've got bills or whatever, you can't pay for them, they'll send you to debtors' prison. Basically, they'll seize all of your possessions and sell them off for whatever money they can get for it to pay your debt. And if it's not enough, then they'll send you to debtor's prison. In debtor's prison, you will work as a laborer for the state until you have paid for your debt. And this could be years and years. Some people never got out of debtor's prison. The bottom line here is that these prisons are filling up with English debtors, and there's no place for them to go. It becomes more practical at this point to just relocate them to somewhere else, say Georgia, this newly formed colony in North America. So these philanthropists, they decide we're going to take these debtors from the English prisons, we're going to relocate them to Georgia, and we'll use them as the settlers in this buffer state. Now these debtors, they're only too happy to go along with this. They say, okay, well, yeah, life sucks here in debtor's prison. I'm probably going to die here, or I can go to the New World and live as a settler in this buffer state. Maybe I'll get killed by the Spanish, maybe not, who knows. I'll rather take my chances living in Georgia than to stay here rotting in prison. So again, this works out well for everybody involved. The settlers are getting out of debtor's prison. They're building a new life for themselves in the New World. The colony of Georgia is firmly established as this buffer state between South Carolina, and Spanish Florida, and everything is fine for now. One thing that makes Georgia unique in this story at this point is that initially the founders of Georgia specifically prohibited slavery. There were to be no slaves at all in Georgia, and they wrote this into their charter. Now, this was for a couple of different reasons. These founders of the Georgia colony, they're philanthropists. They have a specific idea of what this colony is going to be. They want it to be small individual farms. They don't want large-scale plantation here, so they don't want any kind of slaves in Georgia at all. Plus, South Carolina supports this idea as well. If slavery is prohibited in Georgia, then there's not supposed to be any slaves there at all. So if there are any slaves in Georgia, they have run away from South Carolina plantations. And they anticipated this being a problem because Spanish Florida was also a free territory. Spain did not have any slaves in Florida, and in fact they had a kind of a standing offer to slaves in the British Empire. So if you're a slave in the British Empire and you can make your way to Florida, we're going to give you your freedom. You'll live here as a free man. So in order to keep slaves from South Carolina escaping into Spanish Florida, they prohibited slavery in Georgia so that it would be easier to identify the escaped South Carolina slaves. It was never actually a problem, and it didn't last for very long because these planters in Georgia realized that the only real profit was in rice at the time. Cotton wasn't really a big thing at this point, but rice was a very valuable cash crop, and it was also very labor intensive. So these Georgia farmers are realizing that the only way they're going to prosper is by growing rice, and in order to do that, they're going to need a lot of extra labor. And slavery will eventually move into Georgia as well. They'll change the law and allow slavery later on in the mid 1700s. So Georgia is unique in that in the beginning, slavery was specifically prohibited by law, but that changed as a matter of economic necessity. And Georgia will eventually look a lot like South Carolina in terms of its economy and agriculture. So at this point, we've got all 13 of our original British colonies in North America. Well, let's take a look at this map here, just kind of a piece of trivia for you. What we're looking at here is a 1660 map of New Amsterdam. It's part of the New Netherlands, which was originally on what is today New York State, the island of Manhattan. So basically this map, we're looking at lower Manhattan. It's kind of turned on its side here. North is facing off to the right. But this island of Manhattan, this Dutch colony, already has some of the features that we recognize today in New York City. If you've ever been to New York, you've been down to lower Manhattan, the Battery Park, this Dutch fort is still there, or parts of it anyway. Wall Street today, the financial district where the stock exchange is, was named after this northern perimeter of this old Dutch settlement. When the Dutch built this settlement here, much of Manhattan Island was still occupied by Native Americans. So in order to protect themselves, they built a wall at the north end of their little settlement. Well, eventually the colony grew, especially after the British moved in and took over. The colony grows a lot, and the wall is no longer necessary. They occupy most of the island. The Indians are driven off. The wall becomes unnecessary, so they tear it down. But the street that used to run along this wall is named Wall Street. It's still there today. So we see even here, almost 400 years ago, we see some of the things that we recognize today beginning to take shape. Just a little piece of trivia for you there. All right, we've got our 13 colonies. The 13 colonies that will eventually become the 13 states of the United States. So we're starting to see some familiar elements here that are leading us into our overall topic of U.S. history. It's starting to look a little bit more like U.S. history at this point. So these 13 British colonies in North America, we can roughly divide them into 3 separate and distinct regions at this point in the 1730s. We've got our New England colonies, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, We've got the middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, and our southern colonies, Maryland and Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. Now, we've divided them into these three distinct regions because at this point, in the 1730s, they are very distinct regions. In New England, like we've already discussed, we've got a very distinct settlement pattern, small, compact, tight-knit communities centered around religious faith. So that characteristic describes all of these New England colonies. They're all very similar in that respect. Our middle colonies, we've got a very distinctive multicultural character. New York and New Jersey, we've got a lot of Dutchmen living there. Delaware and Pennsylvania, we've got a lot of Germans and other European ethnicities living in these colonies. So these middle colonies have a very distinctive multicultural character. And our southern colonies, as we've already discussed, are starting to all look very similar in that they are centered around plantation agriculture, which is becoming increasingly dependent on slave labor. So we've got three distinct regions of British North America, each with its own cultural character and identity. Now, speaking of cultural character, we talked about that, how with the establishment of Jamestown and Plymouth, we already saw evidence of regional character developing, even from those very first years of colonization. That still holds true at this point, as we see here with these three regions. It's going to continue to develop in this manner for many, many years. We're going to see the social and economic character of these regions continue to develop in these different directions. Eventually, our middle colonies will be more or less absorbed culturally into the New England colonies. So there will be very little difference between New England and middle colonies. We'll just think of them all as northern colonies. In the north, we see this pattern of small family farms, tight-knit communities, compact settlements. In addition to small family farms, subsistence agriculture, we start to see a burgeoning commercial industry and trade starting to take shape in the north. Small cottage industries, shipping and trade. We see some small-scale manufacturing taking place in these towns. And the reason for this is that it's based largely on the type of people living there. We're attracting whole families. We're building communities. Our immigration in the north is gonna take place much more rapidly than in the south. Whole families coming in, whole communities coming in, and with a large population is going to have a large demand for a variety of consumer goods and products. So trade is going to become a very important part of the economic activity in the north. We're going to see a lot more shipping coming in and out of northern cities than we see in the south. We're going to see a lot more cities in the north than we see in the south. The south still defined almost primarily by plantation agriculture. While there is a high demand for labor on these plantations, there's not that many plantation owners. So as far as the citizens of the southern colonies, there are not nearly as many citizens as there are in the north. There are still large numbers of slaves, but at this point, they're not really considering these people as part of the population. Cash crops, mainly tobacco and cotton. We see there at you can't really see that slide. Sorry about that. Tobacco and cotton are the big cash crops in these southern plantations. Eventually, we'll see a lot of other variety in the crops. Rice, indigo, and so forth will be part of this cash crop agriculture in the south. So we see eventually we're going to be divided culturally, economically into a north and a south. Looking at our map here, we can see this a little bit more clearly. When you look at this map, though, this particular illustrator has divided the southern colonies into two separate groups. The Chesapeake colonies, Virginia and Maryland, and then, of course, the lower south of the Carolinas and Georgia. Now, this distinction is not really obvious at first. It'll develop a little bit over the years, and eventually we'll just think of we'll think of the South as one homogeneous region. But there is some difference. When we get closer to the Civil War in the 1840s and 1850s, this will be relevant again as we see the states of the Upper South not depending as heavily on slavery as states in the lower South, and cotton is a big part of that story. But there will be a distinction between upper South and lower South, but right now it's not really really noticeable. Like I say, eventually the northern colonies, the middle colonies, and the New England colonies will just kind of be thought of as one distinctive region. Once immigration picks up in these colonies, we'll see less differences, and this ethnic diversity or cultural diversity will become characteristic of all of the North and not just the middle colonies. One thing I want to draw your attention here to on this map is it's a geographical feature. We refer to it as the fall line. You can see this dotted line running along the whole map here. The fall line, and this is important when you're talking about early colonial settlement. In these early years, most of the settlements took place right along the coast or within a few miles of the coast. And the reason being for this is a ship, an ocean-going ship, could sail upstream on these rivers only so far before it ran into waterfalls and rapids, hence the term fall line. So typically these settlements are going to be restricted to areas that are accessible by ship. In the 1600s, we still depend wholly on boats as our primary form of transportation. There's some hand carts and horse carts in and around some of the villages, but we don't see any kind of interstate roadways connecting any of these colonies. If you want to go from Georgia to South Carolina, you're going to get on a boat and travel up the coast. There are very few overland connections between any of these colonies. So all of our transportation is by boat. So the fall line is a particularly important feature in this particular time frame because that's as far inland as you can go by boat. So we don't really see hardly anybody living beyond this fall line at this point in time. Even though all these colonies claim lands much further inland, there's not really anybody living there except for Native Americans. So this fall line becomes a kind of a de facto boundary between colonial settlements and the Native Americans for many, many years. This, of course, will fade away as time goes on. More colonists come in. We will push further into the interior, and we'll talk more about that later on. We start talking about conflicts between the Native Americans and the European settlers. That's really all we have time for today. When we come back next time, later this week, we're going to get into greater detail on what colonial labor looks like, the growing demand for labor, especially in the southern colonies, and how certain factors are going to contribute to this transition between or from indentured servitude into slavery. There's a lot of stuff going on there. We'll talk more about that next time. Until then, take care.